which we're operating. For most of us, the culture we live in has changed out of all recognition in the last 50 years. It's changed technologically, of course, because we've all got this amazing electronic technology that allows us to do all sorts of things. But the culture has changed hugely. 50 years ago, the number of folk who would have self-identified as Christians in a census would have been a huge proportion of the population. The last ComRes survey that was done in 2017, 6% of the population identified themselves as practicing Christians. So we've moved from a culture which was largely Christian, thought of itself as Christian, to a culture that's increasingly bold in saying that they have no religion at all, and that the number of us who are practicing Christians is quite a small minority. In the Church of England, in the Diocese of Hereford, probably there are about 2.5% of the population in church on an average Sunday. That's pre-COVID, and of course, as we go back into church, it would be a lot less than that. And we're experiencing now a culture where a lot of the things that enforced or encouraged Anglican church identification have gone away. So we are a church that's actually quite vulnerable to that lack of social reinforcement. So, you know, Sunday trading now is a major thing. Sunday sport is a major thing. And increasingly, we live in a culture where people are just plain ignorant of what Christian faith is all about. I remember a few years ago, I was renewing my gym membership when I was a parish priest near Cranley in Surrey, and I went into the gym, and the girl behind the counter got very, very excited. She saw I'd written vicar on the form, and she said, "Oh, shit!" I was very excited. She said, "I was having a conversation with my mate the other day, and we were thinking we need a vicar to answer this question, and you're a vicar, and you can answer the question." So I was very excited at this point. I thought, you know, she's going to ask me something really profound, and she'll be down on her knees in repentance and faith right here in Cranley Leisure Centre. So I was a little taken aback when the question she asked me was, yeah, was Jesus English? And I was even more taken aback when I realised it was a serious question. She wasn't asking to take the mick. She was asking because she didn't know the answer. And I'm afraid that's the level of ignorance that people have of Christian faith. First-year history students in many of our universities have to do a course in basic Christianity because they simply don't understand it. And if you don't understand Christianity, history, particularly anything pre-18th century, makes absolutely no sense at all. So we are living in a very different culture. We're not living in this sort of rose-tinted Christendom. It's a very different context to the one that perhaps we first came to faith many, many years ago. But I would say, given that's the case, the definition of insanity is carrying on doing the same thing and expecting a different result. You have to work with the reality of where you are, and we have to be honest about how we are doing church at the moment and how effective that is at reaching the wider community with Christ, for Christ. Now, I know that is the measurements. Church attendance is a very crude measure of that allegiance, but I do believe that facts are our friends. And so I have done some research. All of your clergy fill in statistics for mission forms, which they absolutely hate doing, but actually in the Diocese of Hereford, they're much, much better at doing it than they ever were in the Diocese of Chichester, I might add. So I want to affirm them all in that. But I've done a little bit of research in looking at the number of adults in the 7 benefices of Ross Deanery, 3-year rolling average, so we even out the peaks and troughs that happen that often do happen year on year. And I want to show you what those results are. Now, I want to say very clearly that this is not designed to name and shame, so I'm not going to tell you the names of the benefices in question. And the second thing I want to say is that these are percentage figures, and of course, if you're in a very small church, a small number of people will look like a large percentage. So don't necessarily be alarmed by some of the figures here, but they're just an indication of the sort of pattern that we see. Now, those are the 7 benefices in the deanery. And the range of change in that 3-year rolling average over that 5-year period ranges from 1 benefice, where the actual Sunday attendance has gone up by just over 20%, in various stages, and these are different benefices, down to 1 benefice where the attendance has gone down by about 70%. Now, of course, again, if that's a small number of people to start with, a small number of people not coming is going to have a huge effect on the figures. So don't be too alarmed by that. But just what I want to say from this, and this is a pattern that I have seen, I think, in every single deanery, every single parish that I've ever done a parish vision day for, and I did loads of those when I was a diocesan mission advisor. You see this pattern more or less universally, that in a deanery there will be a huge range of between growth and decline in parishes that are geographically quite close to one another, maybe even quite similar. So what I would conclude from that picture is that decline is not inevitable. We can very easily buy into this narrative that says, well, basically, we're all too old, we're all going to die off, and the last person can turn the light off. And there's no vested interest in the media telling a story any other than that, because it's, you know, it's much more interesting than stories of fruitfulness and success. But what it does show then is that if decline is not inevitable, there may well be things that we can do to affect whether our church is growing or declining, as measured by this very crude measure. And you know, there's all sorts of caveats you could hedge around it, but it is a crude measure of the difference. So if that's the case, we do need to think then, given that's where we are, about how COVID affects us and what we need to do, how we need to change and reflect on the way we need to be as church, because there's no doubt that COVID-19 has radically changed the landscape. But interestingly, the sociological research tells us that in response to a crisis, actually 80% of stuff, as however you measure it, will go back to the way it was before the crisis. But 20% won't. And our key challenge as we think forward to about what a post-COVID church looks like is what's in that 20%. Now, I think that may vary from context to context, but 2 things do stand out for me from the evidence that we have so far, one of which is a challenge and one of which is an opportunity. And we know that probably between 25 and 30% of the people who used to come to church before COVID haven't engaged at all with anything electronic or anything else. And that's going to present quite a challenge for us as we begin to come back together in worship. People who've become disconnected from the church through COVID, how we maintain pastoral contact with them, help them to realize they're still a valuable part of our church community, and woo them back into being part of the church community. So that's one challenge. But the second thing is a huge opportunity. And that is that at least 30% apparently of the people who have been engaging with us through electronic media, through live stream services, for all that sort of thing, overall, about 30% of those people apparently have not been in contact with the church much before. So we've got a challenge to welcome back into community those who've disengaged, but there's also a challenge about those who have engaged with us in ways that we weren't anticipating. How do we reach out to them and include them in the way that we are going to be going forward? So that I think we have to be realistic about COVID and the effects that's going to have. Now, let me just share just a few observations of my sort of how long is it? I've been about 4, no, gosh, it's February, March, April, May, June, 5 months. Most of it I seem to have spent in my study or my garden because I've been locked in like all the rest of us. But some observations through my multiple Zoom contacts with people and now more and more face-to-face. The first thing is that the people of the Diocese of Hereford are remarkably flexible and creative when they respond to reality as it is, rather than how we'd like it to be. So some of the amazing things that people do in response to COVID, in the way they've been church in which they've signed gatherings, in the which they've maintained contact with people who can't engage with church internet connection, in the way in which they've made connections with the wider community, help people being lonely. Huge amounts of really amazing creative energy in response to facing the reality of life as it is. COVID defines our reality. There are certain things we just can't do, therefore we have to do. And so it's remarkable to see how amazing creative you all are. And that seems to me to give, and the creativity has flowed out of recognizing reality and living out of that reality. What we have to do, I think, as we move forward, is just to be honest about the reality as it is, and therefore adopt the same sort of creativity as we seek to move forward into a new future together. The second thing I'd say, and again, this is a universal observation that is found in every single bit of research about church growth, is that growth is an emergent property of spiritual life, not an end in itself. That actually most church growth research will tell you that if your spiritual life in your church community is vibrant and alive, then that tends to become an attractive place, attractive community for people to become a part of. Having growth on its own as a target is not necessarily, it's an emergent property, not necessarily something that you can target specifically. So that leads me to think that one of the things we need to be thinking about in our strategies, both as a church and as a deanery, is how do we warm up the spiritual life of our church communities? Because it's that spiritual contrast with the sort of secular world in which we live in that generates the tension that tends to pull people to consider claims of Jesus Christ. The third thing is that diversity is a strength. When I was a parish priest in Sussex, I had a huge variety of people in my congregation because we were a very geographically focused ministry. From those who thought that anything written after 1662 was a dangerous modern experiment, to those who thought if we don't sing 30 minutes of Jesus is my girlfriend songs one after the other, we're not worshipping properly. And it was quite a difficult tension to keep those all together in one, and there's perhaps another story how I think we managed to do that. But there is a myth out there that in order to grow, you somehow have to become something you aren't. So you have, shoot the choir and the organist, bring out the guitars, and then suddenly these vast number of people will suddenly come and join us for worship on a Sunday morning. Now, we all know that's a myth, because I've seen priests try and do that. I wouldn't recommend that without doing some very serious preparatory work first. My research when I was Diocese Missionary in Chichester was that every single tradition within the Church of England is perfectly capable of growth. You don't have to be evangelical to be evangelistic. Every church, a liberal church, a more Catholic church, an evangelical church, all of them have the potential within them to grow. All of them have the potential actually within them to decline. Growth is not at all the province of simply one tradition in the church. Diversity really is a strength. It seems to me the thing is to work out what is your strength and play to that and be the people, the tradition that you inhabit and that is natural to you as a community, but do it to the best that you can and make sure it's coming out of a spiritual root. Tradition is a good thing because it links us to the past. Traditionalism is not a good thing because it makes the form the thing that we value rather than the underlying substance. The fourth thing I want to say is that and this is a quote from an American church growth theologian, is that the local church is the hope of the world and its future rests primarily in the hands of its leaders. I am a passionate believer in the power of a local church. I mean, when I was a vicar in a local church in Sussex, it was at a time when there was lots and lots of excitement and talk about fresh expressions of church, and this was the answer. And I tended to say, well, actually, I lead a stale expression of church, and it's not doing that badly, thank you very much. Parochial ministry is still the absolute heart of who we are and what we do. Every blade of grass is in somebody's parish. And everything that, certainly while I'm the Bishop of Hereford, everything that we do in terms of central strategy must be directed to resourcing the local church, the local parish, local clergy, local leaders, because you are the folk who are the ones who do the witnessing, you're the ones who do the serving, you're the ones who are worshipping locally, you're the ones who provide a community that embraces and welcomes people who are broken and hurting. That's where the action is. You know, where's the centre of the diocese? The centre of the diocese is 404 parish churches grouped into 80 benefices. It's not Hereford. It's not the palace here. It's not the diocesan office. It's that's the centre of the parish. I'm absolutely passionately committed to that we do everything that we can to make sure that is resourced as best it can possibly be. But there are, alongside those observations, I think there are some significant challenges, and you will be aware of these yourself, of course, and these are the things that we really have to address. We do have a significant challenge as a diocese as to how we prioritise our mission alongside the entirely legitimate responsibilities that we have for our buildings. My anxiety is, in some places, the building it's not unimportant, so don't please hear me saying that, but we've become so focused on the building and we're holding so tenaciously to this mission to keep the building going that somehow and what often happens is that you hold tenaciously onto something and by so doing you hasten its demise. The way to preserve 404 active parish church buildings in the Diocese of Hereford is to have 404 vibrant spiritual communities worshipping in them. Simply making the building the entire focus of what we're about, and that by default neglecting the financial commitments to ministry and mission mean that we will eventually lose the very thing that we really want to keep hold of. So I think there's a real challenge about that, and it's a real tension I recognise, because of course I know that these buildings are important, they're important to local communities, we have a responsibility to take to look after them, but how do we balance that responsibility with our primary calling as Christian disciples to go and make disciples of all nations, as Jesus told us to do? Second challenge I want to raise with you is how do we rise above what I would call a narrow parochialism to see the bigger picture? I think when we're under pressure, a natural temptation for all of us is just simply to circle the wagons and concentrate on what we know, what we feel we can control. But I think what COVID tells us is, and actually what a lot of people are saying, and is obvious to me, is that the future for our church lies in a much more collaborative picture. It lies in churches working together much more closely within benefices. In terms of our desire to serve the community, it looks like much more partnership between us as church communities and the wider community. It certainly looks like partnership between us and our ecumenical partners in other denominations. That I think the church of the future, to be fruitful, is going to be a much more collaborative place between different communities and between our community and the wider community that wouldn't describe ourselves as Christians. And that, again, is about raising our sights above, just this responsibility for looking after this building and this church, and how are we going to keep the whole thing going? How do we look about collaborating together? The third thing I've observed, and you always know this as well, that doing mission and ministry costs more than we're currently prepared to pay for it. And that is a real challenge for us. I mean, I'm going to talk. We're going to have a diocesan gift day on the 20th of September, which is not just about addressing the financial challenges of the diocese. It's not going to be giving to the diocese, it's going to be giving through the local church, and it's going to be preceded by 4 Saturdays when I'm going to be doing a tour around the outside of the diocese and encouraging all of us to pray together. But the bare fact of the matter is that we aren't giving enough as a diocesan family to sustain the ministry that we really need. And I think, although we've made some serious attempts, I mean, I can assure you that the central structures of the diocese are stripped back to more or less to the bone. There is very little, if any, slack in the centre in order to do what we need to do in order to run as an institution. And we've also already made some decisions through the Diocesan Synod to reduce the number of stipendiary clergy. My anxiety at the moment is that our benefices, as we have them currently constituted, actually teeter on the brink of being benefices that no one is going to want to come and be vicar of, if I'm honest. Because there is a shortage of clergy, there are lots of options out there, and we have a number of structural difficulties about encouraging clergy to come to the diocese anyway, around spouse employment and things like that. I really am going to do all that I can to keep our level of parochial clergy more or less at the level as it is at the moment. And if we have the resources, I'd love to have more, because one of the key indicators in research is that there is a direct correlation between the number of clergy you have and church growth. So I'm certainly not going to be looking to try and slash and burn if we can possibly avoid it. But in order to do that, we need to have a really honest conversation about money and the realistic cost of what it is to support our parochial ministry. The fourth thing for breakfast. So if the culture of your church is not right, you can come up with any number of schemes and programs and things that you might like to do. But if you haven't got the invitational culture, you're going to really struggle. So you can have your Alpha course, but who's going to invite people on your Alpha course? You have Messy Church. Who's going to invite people to come to Messy Church? Two very, very interesting figures. I'm sorry, I am a bit of a nerd for statistics, but I do believe it's important that we respond to reality as it's indicated to us, not anecdote. Two figures that probably tell you most of what you need to know about current growth and decline in the Church of England are 9 and 92. 9 is a recent survey, is the percentage of Anglican worshippers who would consider inviting a friend to come to church with them. 92 is the percentage of people in some of the new church plants, particularly those that have been put out by HTB, Holy Trinity Brompton, London. 92% is the percentage of churches considering inviting a friend to come to church with them. I think that figure, more than anything to do with worship style, explains why those churches tend to be growing really, really powerfully. It's an invitational culture. Now, if you or you go to a great play, I bet that you would talk to your friends about it. That was fantastic. You need to come. Now, again, statistics tell us that there are a large people in our wider community church if somebody invited them. So, more than any changes in worship style, I think that's often just a complete, because actually there's very few people, I think, sitting at home on a Sunday morning reading their Sunday papers thinking, oh, if only St. Swithin's in the Swamp got their worship style right, I'd be up there like a shot. There are some much more fundamental reasons why people don't engage with the church than that. But a culture of invitation could have a radical change difference to well, this is something that I find a real blessing, and perhaps I could invite someone to come and join me. I mean, not necessarily every Sunday, but events that you could be putting on, particular times of year, carol services, moments of life that are so integral to the life of our church. You could invite people to come to those things. That wouldn't necessarily be too difficult. they probably find they really enjoyed it. Actually, that's what usually happens most of the time. So culture is incredibly important. And the final thing is, are we really prepared to make room for the new and experimental? We have a limited amount of time, a limited amount of energy, we have a limited amount of all sorts of things, resources. All of our time in all our working life is filled with what we really like and really desire. That's lovely. How do we find room for something different? How do we find room for, and this is not saying that, you've all got to stop going to the BCP services and go to something else. It's not saying that, but how do we make room for the new, for spaces for other people who just aren't going to connect with us through our current way of worshiping? How do we find spaces for that in order to be more open and welcoming and allow people in? And I think that probably implies a degree of stuff going on in parallel. I think it probably means that we will have to be looking at an online presence probably more or less permanently now, because that's created a whole different fringe of people. I think things like, messy churches, alpha courses, all of these other Christian inquirers courses, they need space. They need, times when it's most convenient that we want to come. The question about realize that we need to change. We recognize that we're all getting older and not attracting people to be part of our community life. And by this I don't mean Sunday, because that's only a small segment of what it is to be church, broader than that. But the question is, are we prepared to be open to really making space for others to be part of who we are in other ways? So here's just a few thoughts about how this might go forward. I'm talking very much in broad brush principles here. I think if we're going to formulate both parochial strategies and a wider deanery strategy that incorporates all of those, what's absolutely crucial is that we listen carefully to what people think. So the first thing I'd like us to be doing as part of the formulation of strategy is I didn't get to it because Mark and Patrick arrived a bit too early, so I haven't quite finished it yet. But I've got that we could form of a parochial consultation, that you gather together folk in your church and just work through together some serious questions, looking at where we are, what sort of things would we. The first question is, imagine you're an APCM in 2025 and your vicar stands up and he gives thanks for the amazing things that have happened in the last 5 years. What would be those things that would really energize you and say, gosh, wouldn't it be fabulous in 5 years' time this had happened in church? And starting from where you really feel that you'd like to be, basically it's about taking the steps back. Well, what sort of things might we need to be doing to get from here to there? What changes might we need to make? What is it that's stopping us making those sorts of changes? What are the barriers to those sorts of things that we might begin to identify, the little steps that we might make? And they may well be quite modest. One of the problems often in mission action plans is they're far too grand. There's far too much in it for the resources that you've got. It doesn't have to be, a grand transformational thing, but just realistic little steps that you could make to just a vision that's within, you feel might be within your grasp. So that's the next step. And again, I think it's very important that this sort of process is bottom up, because ultimately we want something that's integrated, parochial plans integrated with deanery plans. But what I would say is that they need to be evidence-based. So the things that you're planning to do probably need to be things that evidence shows might make a difference. I often used to find this when I was doing vision days with parishes. they have all sorts of great ideas, but realistically, that's a great idea. It'll take you a lot of time and a lot of energy, and frankly, it's not going to make a blind bit of difference. And so I think it is important that part of the bottom-up aspirational thing is married together with sort of outside advice, looking at the sort of evidence that we have to produce something that has a sensible coherence with reality and may have an opportunity to make a difference. And ultimately what we're after, I mean, you probably won't get full, complete and utter buy-in, but we're after something that is owned by the congregation as a whole. It's not something that's, you know, imposed. I was saying this in my video, you know, I'm the bishop, I could say, I want you to do this, this, and this. And most of the clergy would get fed up and it's initiative overload from the centre and bears no relation to our context, and they'd be absolutely right. The fact is, you know, I can give a steer, I can say something about the culture, I can paint the brush, I can hold our feet to the fire in terms of being realistic about the reality in which we inhabit. But ultimately, I find that if you tell people, if people really understand the reality as it is, and they see the resources that are available, very often solutions will emerge and bubble up from beneath, which are owned by people. And those are ultimately the solutions that will be transformative, because they're the solutions that are owned by people and that the people want to participate in. So that's a sort of picture, I hope, that of where you might go with this. Something that's collaborative, bottom up, but you get a strategy that emerges from that is realistic, collaborative, invitational, shifts the culture, and begins to broaden your reach into a wider community and helps people to come and embrace. And ultimately, the important question we need to ask is not how can we get more people to come to church. The important question is how can we encourage more people to follow Jesus? Because if you ask the first question, you'll probably do all sorts of interesting things. I mean, I know how to get a church full of young people. Just put it in and can light a lot of candles in the dark and they'll probably come and sit there. That's a lot of people. But how do we encourage people to follow? If you answer that second question, how can you encourage people to follow Jesus, you will find the answer to your first question. Because I think going to church is a symptom of Christianity. It's not the disease itself. And if you encourage more people to follow Jesus, more people will come to church. More people coming to church will mean you have a larger community, which means you can do more in the wider community, which means you have more people who can participate in the life of the local church, and ultimately more people who can help you support the building and see the church grow. So I would want to say, be hopeful. Don't be despairing. Don't think, oh, there's nothing we can do. We'll just circle the wagons and maybe, you know, this will see us out. We have got the same Holy Spirit within us, in whose power Christ did his miracles, in whose power Christ rose from the dead, and who descended upon the disciples at Pentecost. We don't have Division 2 Holy Spirit, and they had Premier League. It's the same Spirit. And the power of God is as accessible to us through prayer as it was to any generation of Christians before us. So be encouraged that the future can be bright. It won't be without its struggles and tensions. It won't be without the need for us to make sacrifices. But the sacrifices we might have to make may not be the sacrifices that you're afraid that you think you might have to make. They may be something perhaps slightly different and slightly deeper than that. But I think potentially they can be transformative. Okay, that's enough.